Okay, guys, today we're going to talk about how peer review perpetuates the greatest scientific fraud of all time. So for those of you who don't know about how science is actually brought out into the public domain, basically scientists will do their research at their institutions, universities, and whatnot, and then they write papers with their results of whatever it is that they're researching that they had some interest in. They will write down those results into a paper and a description of what happened and what they were doing and what the results were all into a paper. And then these papers that they write get submitted to journals. And the journals will then perform an editorial review on the papers called a peer review. And the journals do this by sending the paper out to anonymously to other people that work in the same field, but anonymously, so that the people reviewing the papers don't know who actually wrote it, so that it's kind of a blind process going on. Just the idea is to sort of eliminate bias in case you know the person that you're reviewing. So then the reviewers will look at the paper and they'll see if there's any errors that they think they've detected in it, or if they have questions about what was done in the person's research, they'll ask that, and then there'll be a back and forth a couple times, and then they will say either accepted for review or not accepted, for publication, accepted for publication or not. And usually they typically are, unless you make some pretty gross errors, or if it's just gibberish, although sometimes gibberish does actually get through, and other researchers researching the peer review method itself have actually shown that it is possible to submit gibberish papers with totally fake science on purpose that was made up into these journals, and then they still sometimes actually get through. So it's supposed to be a method that works, but it doesn't always work. And now we're actually finding, and I'll prove to you, I'll demonstrate to you that the peer review is now actually perpetuating, the peer review system is now perpetuating this greatest fraud of all time, which is climate alarm and its greenhouse effect, and its spreading sunshine over the entire surface area of the Earth at once as its starting point. So before all this, before I was producing any videos and before I wrote my book, I had submitted my own paper to a science journal, to an environmental journal, to make all the points that I do in these videos and that I did in my book. And the paper was basically saying that the community should think about whether this starting point of climate alarm and climate physics and its greenhouse effect of these flat lines, which represent flat Earths, which represent sunshine being spread over the entire surface area of the Earth at once, if that actually really makes sense to do that. Now, it's kind of a curious thing, because on one level, you should simply be able to state to another person that, especially a scientist, that, the Earth isn't actually flat and sunlight doesn't actually spread over the entire surface area of the Earth at once. And so these diagrams don't actually represent anything in reality, and what you're deriving out of them, because you're making sunshine freezing cold and then inventing a system where the climate creates itself, that kind of doesn't make sense, right? You should be able to just state that to someone, especially to another scientist, and have them accept it and say, yeah, we need to, spread this around, make sure everybody knows, and let's restart how we're doing this. But you can't actually do that for some reason, because this has become totally accepted as the foundation of climate physics in all of academia and all in the textbooks, as we've been seeing in my videos. So what I had to do was I had to figure out a way to write a paper, a scientific paper, using enough technical and mathematical justification to demonstrate that, indeed, flat Earth physics and mathematics that you derive from flat Earth isn't valid, and it's not physically valid to spread sunshine over the entire surface area of the Earth at once. I had to figure out, well, how do you write a paper in science? I'm a scientist myself. As you know, I have a master's degree in astrophysics. I'm a practicing scientist, and I write papers and assist writing other papers with other scientists in journals. So I know how to write a science paper in my own field, no problem. But this is a different kind of a paper, because in this paper, I'm not doing new research or anything like that and presenting new research or something new that's been done. I'm simply having to point out something that exists, which makes no sense. And that's kind of different. That's not really done that much in science. That's not really how a science paper and research is conducted. That's not really how science is conducted. Nevertheless, it's something that needed to be done. So let's go to my paper and let's read what happened. So here's my paper. I put this all in my book, and my book is titled In the Cold Light of Day, which you can buy on Amazon in either Kindle or paperback version. So I have as a chapter of my book the paper that I submitted to the environmental journal and what their response was. And you're going to find their response to be absolutely hilarious and mind-boggling. Like I said, you should be able to just state to someone, the Earth isn't actually flat and sunlight doesn't actually spread over the entire surface area of the Earth at once as an input. And so, that's wrong. You should be able to just state that and have other people understand it, especially physicists, because, anyone in the real world doing real work out there can understand that. But for some reason in academia, you can't get that level of understanding from people. It's curious. So anyway, so here's my paper. So all I did was I said, here's how the greenhouse effect starts. Here's the basis of climate science. What you do is you calculate this thing called the effective black body temperature, which is just what the average temperature of the Earth is supposed to be, given its average radiative output. Okay, and I just say that's the basic equation, and we do this in astronomy, and everyone should be familiar with that because it's part of the scientific sort of educational program in physics especially, and in astronomy. So you calculate this temperature, you calculate this flux, and you get your answer, and it comes out to 240 watts per meter squared or minus 18 degrees Celsius as an output. So I just say that's what we do in physics, and this is a good educational thing to see what the output of the Earth is. And then I say, here's what the consensus radiative greenhouse effect is, and I just show it. I don't say anything about it. I just say this is what it is. It's using that black body temperature, which we calculated previously as the output. It's using it here as the input, and it's doing this, and it's saying these things, and it's just say this is what it is. There's a bunch of references that you can go find about it, and that's it. So then in my next chapter, I just say we should note that there's a distinction between greenhouse effects. On the one hand, this climate science greenhouse effect is different than how an actual real greenhouse functions. And I don't have any references here because I assume that it's common knowledge that a real greenhouse functions by preventing convective cooling, by stopping the air that's warmed inside the greenhouse from convecting away to be replaced by cooler air. I assume that that's common knowledge, and so I don't have to reference that, right? And then I say, so that's the one effect, and then I say, but then I make the note that the radiative greenhouse effect is something else. It's where instead of hot sunlight coming in, and you're trapping the air warmed by that hot sunlight in place so that you have a hot parcel of air inside the greenhouse. Instead, what's happening in the radiative greenhouse of climate alarm is that you have cold sunshine coming in, and then the atmosphere warms up to a temperature much higher than it was ever heated at in the first place due to this process they call the greenhouse effect, which is essentially the climate creating itself. So I just say that's an important distinction to make. And then I say, and then I point out in my next chapter, here's some practical flaws in the radiative greenhouse effect. I say one flaw is, and I'm talking about a physical flaw. I'm talking about a physical flaw that doesn't actually really make much sense. And I say one flaw is its characterization of the input to the planet's surface. They're depicting an input up to 240 watts per meter squared or minus 18 degrees Celsius, but that's actually the output. So I say, that's kind of something non-physical they're doing. They're reversing the output for the input. The output is only minus 18 degrees Celsius. And that's simply not equivalent. And so then I also make the point that the solar input is very high temperature and is able to generate very high temperatures, and so it doesn't make sense to reverse the output for the input where the output is now only minus 18 degrees Celsius. So then I say the greenhouse diagrams also depict the Earth as a flat plane with sunshine spread over the entire surface area at once, and I say that's not realistic and not physical. The Earth isn't flat, and incoming power from the sun is not distributed evenly across the entire surface area of the Earth. And then I say that there's a paradox embedded here. Obviously, that's a physical paradox, right? And then I point out that the sun can generate very high temperatures, up to 100 degrees Celsius. And so I make the point that the real sunlight input can create the climate and can melt water, whereas this input that they're using is only minus 18 degrees Celsius, and then you can't explain how sunlight can melt ice or evaporate water. So I make those points. I say, here's a series of physical paradoxes, of physical inconsistencies to reality that don't make sense. And then I go into theoretical flaws. So I go into thermal physics textbooks where I pull out the definition of heat and how heat is defined in thermodynamics. And these are all references from textbooks. So here's a thermal physics textbook, a textbook on thermodynamics. And here's another one, or this from the same book. And then here's a different book from thermodynamics, a book titled Thermodynamics. And then here was another one called Classical and Statistical Thermodynamics. And then this one was Elementary Applied Partial Differential Equations, which is also all about thermodynamics. And so all these quotes are defining what heat flow is. They're defining heat and what heat is. And so I make the point that given the definitions of what heat flow is, you can't say that there's therefore no mechanism where a colder atmosphere could make a warmer surface warmer, because that violates all of these definitions of what heat flow is and how thermodynamics actually functions. So I make the point that there is no mechanism by which the cooler atmosphere could cause a warmer surface to become warmer by radiant interaction, because you would need either work or heat to be supplied by the atmosphere to the surface. But the atmosphere can provide neither work nor heat to the surface because the surface is warmer. So it's impossible. So it's a basic thermodynamic impossibility for the rated greenhouse effect of climate physics. It's an impossibility for it to work or function at all, let alone all of these physical paradoxes and physically meaningless foundations upon which it's derived. So then I just say that logical at the end. In the conclusion, I say consistency is found is that if it begins with a false representation of reality, and by that I mean a false model. We're starting with a false model of reality, sunshine spread over the entire surface area of the Earth at once. The Earth is a flat plane, essentially. And then you derive some things, then necessarily because you're starting from somewhere false, you're going to end with false derivations. And so I say the physical falsities, the physical paradoxes and errors in the derivation lead to results which are inconsistent with theory as well. And of course, that's what you would expect as for logical consistency. You're starting from a position that's non-physical and has nothing to do with reality, and then you derive necessarily results that violate existing known laws of physics and how we know that reality behaves via thermodynamics. Okay, so that was basically the paper, just, very scientific, very just to the point, no hyperbole or no accusations of anyone having done anything wrong. I'm just saying this is what happened, and, this doesn't actually make sense, and here's the errors with it. And I just say that's the point. We should think about this as a community, and hopefully then the community can fix this mistake and come up with better science. So I want to show you then the peer review. And so let's look at what the peer reviewers said about this paper and why they rejected it. So first, here's the first thing they said. There should be some solid theoretical evidence provided to support that your proposed idea was a better method or model, which would lead to some scientifically significant results. So basically he's saying that I need some solid theoretical evidence that flat earth physics is bad science, and that those starting points don't make sense because they have nothing to do with reality. And so you see, I cannot actually just go tell a scientist that flat earth physics is bad science. And even after explaining what is wrong with the flat earth mathematics and the propositions that get created from them, it still doesn't matter, because what the results of changing away from these false and fraudulent things isn't clear that it will result in a significant scientific impact. In other words, in modern science, he's saying there's nothing theoretically wrong with flat earth physics, and it isn't clear to them that having non-flat earth physics would provide any difference, would be important at all. So now then he goes on to say, the discussion statements are speculative rather than supported on substantial descriptions. Oh, his English actually wasn't very good here. Descriptions and extensions from the experimental data. So basically what he's saying, that it's only speculation. He's saying that I'm speculating that flat earth physics is bad science, and it's not clear that non-flat earth physics would be supported from experimental data. So he's saying it's not clear that non-flat earth physics would be supported from experimental data. It would be excellent if the importance of this issue were validated by detailed research and thoroughly documented data. So he's saying that I need to produce detailed research and thoroughly documented data to be able to speak against flat earth physics. I mean, they completely miss the point. Modern science cannot reject flat earth physics on theoretical, philosophical, or mathematical grounds, but requires detailed research and thoroughly documented data to do so. That's what he's saying. The paper aimed to criticize derivations of radiative greenhouse effect, which violates the laws of thermodynamics established upon an unphysical and unrealistic model. Yes, however, the paper itself lacks a number of evidences to justify its rationality and importance. So he's saying that the paper lacks evidence that the Earth is spherical rather than flat, and that even if this is so, there's no evidence that it is a rationally important distinction. So the paper lacks evidence to justify its rationality and importance. So I lack evidence of what I'm bringing forth in the paper, that flat earth theory, that flat earth physics is bad science. I lack evidence to provide. I lack evidence in my paper. Like, I'm assuming that it should be just taken at face value because it's obvious to anybody. The paper showed that the radiative greenhouse effect theory was based on an unrealistic and unphysical model. Now get this, guys, listen to this. To what extent do you suppose the model is deviated from reality? So dear reader, or dear viewer this time, to what extent do you suppose that flat earth is deviated from reality? Can you believe he actually asked me this? This is why they rejected my paper, because look at what he says. The paper showed that the radiative greenhouse effect theory was based on unrealistic and unphysical model. Yeah, that's what I showed. That's about the Earth being drawn as a flat line. That's about sunshine being diluted over the entire surface area of the Earth at once. So he's restating what I stated, basically. But then he asks, to what extent do you suppose this model is deviated from reality? So to what extent do you suppose the model of a flat Earth with sunshine spread over the entire surface area of the Earth at once is deviated from reality? To what extent? Well, to 100% extent, to complete extent, to the entire extent of reality, it is deviated from reality. But he's asking me, how much do I think it is? And they're asking me for evidence to show that it is. If the author regards the radiative greenhouse effect theory as totally false, what's your alternative? How to validate your alternative? Well, I didn't want to produce an alternative, and I'm not going to produce an alternative. There's no need to. Why would I need to produce an alternative? The entire scientific community can do that, or people who are paid to do that specifically can do that. I'm pointing out that what we have, the existing model, this flat earth physics model, with sunlight spread over the entire surface area of the Earth at once, I'm pointing out that it's wrong because of its physical foundations. I don't have to provide an entire alternative. I just have to point out that what is existing, that what exists is wrong. No evidence shows in the manuscript that the origin of radiative greenhouse effect and its development. So he's saying that these people's English, apparently their English wasn't very good. If the authors really want to criticize it, I strongly suggest the authors giving a holistic review regarding it. Well, I did provide references to the radiative greenhouse effect. I showed you exactly where it came from, and I explained in that text exactly how it was derived and where it came from, and the models where it came from. So now he's just saying you need to give me a complete, a more holistic review. Well, I mean, that was a review. I mean, you could have just asked for that instead of just entirely rejecting my paper. Sure, I can provide any number of references, and I did in that paper. I actually provided several references to where the greenhouse effect is derived, to how it's derived, in those models that you have all seen now in my videos. Thermodynamics can be applied to valid radiative greenhouse effect theory. To validate it, according to the second law of thermodynamics, heat cannot flow from the cooler to the warmer. Yes, of course, but it can absorb the heat from the Earth. Yeah, but that's not what the greenhouse effect is. See, they don't even understand what I'm talking about. They don't even understand what the greenhouse effect is. The greenhouse effect isn't just that the warmer surface is radiating into the atmosphere and thereby warming up the atmosphere. The greenhouse effect is the atmosphere creating the climate within itself, is the climate creating itself. They missed that point entirely. And let's just skip Um, Too many presumptions in the manuscript without appropriate citation. So he's asking me for citations, right? He's saying that readers won't be convinced without citations that the Earth isn't flat and that flat Earth physics is bad science. I need to somehow provide references and citations to that. I make presumptions about the Earth not being flat and that this would have important scientific consequences. He's saying it doesn't matter. I mean, can you imagine? Like, think of Galileo and Copernicus and all those people. If just in the end we say, well, it doesn't matter if the sun is the center of the solar system. That doesn't matter. Let's just keep the old way. It doesn't matter if the Earth is round versus flat. Let's just keep going with flat Earth theory. Why do we care about what's true? We like the flat Earth model. I mean, could you imagine if when has science or truth ever progressed that way? We abandon and discard the bad ideas because we prefer the better new ideas which correspond with reality, right? Silly. So he's saying the paper is not a rigorous scientific manuscript. Well, no, how am I going to provide evidence to you in an original paper that the Earth is round and that flat Earth physics is bad science? I mean, to what extent? Like I said, how come I can't just say this? So I did provide some mathematics and some references and some demonstrations that it makes no sense, but it's still not sufficient for them. So yeah, in the end, I think the manuscript has to be rejected. So I did not comprehensively discuss that the Earth isn't flat and that this has important mathematical and physical consequences that affects the physics of what you derive subsequently of the implicit underlying assumptions. I criticize the flat Earth classical theory of climate-alarmism without appreciation. What does that even mean? It's not relevant information that the Earth isn't flat and that this is an important distinction and has an effect on the physics and the mathematics. So there you go. So even if you try these days to submit a paper through peer review, on the one hand, let's just go step back for a second. On the one hand, I can't actually just go to a scientist face to face and say, hey, you know what? Flat Earth theory doesn't make sense. This is a flat line, and sunlight is being spread over the entire surface area of the Earth at once. As in these diagrams here at the foundation of climate science. I can't just go out and state and just have a tacit immediate agreement. Yeah, you're right. Earth isn't flat. Sunshine isn't spread over the entire surface area of the Earth at once, and it's thermodynamically impossible to have the climate therefore create itself because sunshine is now only minus 18 degrees Celsius. Yeah, you're right. That makes no sense. Let's trash all this and start over. They just can't do that. They won't do that. So much for the scientific method and science self-correcting and criticizing itself. That's the last thing science actually does. The last thing scientists do and science does is actually look for errors within itself. So you can't just go have that discussion. So then you got to figure out, well, how do I write a paper to actually explain in scientific terms and mathematical terms, sufficiently technical enough that you can't actually do this, that it makes no sense and it's not physically consistent to do those things, to spread sunlight over the entire surface area of the Earth at once, and for the climate to create itself. So I did that in a paper, and then I still say, well, you don't have sufficient evidence. You don't have sufficient evidence to say that those things are wrong. So the peer review process, those people were telling me, I didn't provide sufficient evidence that the Earth isn't flat, and that creating a model and making derivations in physics based on flat Earth physics won't lead to reality. I need to somehow provide evidence. I mean, the evidence is self-evident. The evidence is the derivation itself. The evidence is their diagrams. That's the evidence I presented. The evidence is this. This is the evidence. The evidence is that this is a flat line. They're diluting sunshine over the entire surface area of the Earth at once to make sunshine only minus 18 degrees Celsius. And then they're having the climate create itself. That's the evidence. What more evidence do you need? That is the evidence that this model itself has nothing to do with reality. But it's not sufficient for peer review. So peer review has now locked itself, has now become locked into a position of defending and supporting and spreading flat Earth theory amongst the scientific academic community, because nobody can actually provide evidence that spherical Earth theory with sunshine falling only over a hemisphere at once is any better than their currently accepted flat Earth theory with sunshine spread over the entire surface area of the Earth at once. Isn't that amazing? So, I think that's it for this video. Hope you liked it, and take care. Bye.